I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today, we're going to talk all about how to optimize your workspace for maximum productivity, to heighten levels of focus, to increase levels of creativity. And by the end, you will have a checklist of things that you can do to optimize your workspace on any budget. I'm going to explain how, for zero cost, that makes you maximally productive, maximally focused. The first variable we want to think about in terms of workspace optimization is vision and light. I talked about the importance of dividing your 24-hour day into 3 different phases. I'm just going to briefly summarize what I described. From the time you wake up in the morning until about 6 or 7 or 8, sometimes 9 hours later, your brain is in a unique state. It is in a state of high levels of dopamine, a neuromodulator, and high levels of epinephrine, as well as hormones like cortisol and so forth. Without going into the biology of those things, they set your brain into a state of high alertness. And this is true whether or not you indulge in caffeine or not. Being in a brightly lit environment can lend itself to optimal work throughout the day. While on many episodes of this podcast, I've also emphasized the importance of getting morning sunlight in your eyes within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Now and again, I will also mention that it's important to light your daytime environment as brightly as you safely can. So if you are going to be doing work in this early, what I call phase 1 portion of your day, you want to have as much light and indeed as much overhead light shining on you as safely possible. What's special about overhead lights for setting alertness is that the neurons in our eyes, which are called melanopsin ganglion cells, that's the fancy name, are mainly enriched in the lower half of our retinas in our eyes and view the upper visual field. Those neurons send little wires to an area of our hypothalamus right above the roof of our mouth that creates a state of alertness. Now, and this phase 1 of our circadian cycle is when we are best at doing analytic, detail type work. Particular overhead lights are going to facilitate focus. They're going to facilitate further release of things like dopamine and norepinephrine and healthy amounts of cortisol. And we want that to happen early in the day for a variety of reasons. For instance, we don't want that cortisol peak to happen too late in the day. That's actually associated with depression and insomnia and a number of things that we just don't want. So one of the things that I've done for my workspace is to make sure that when I wake up in the morning, I do go get my sunlight. If the sun isn't out, I turn on as many bright artificial lights as I can manage or tolerate, and then I go get my sunlight exposure. But once I set out to do some work, that all the overhead lights in that room are on. Now, the way that one could do that could be a very low-cost way of having, for instance, a desk lamp and those overhead lights. If you're somebody that wants to take this to the next level, you can purchase ring lights. Can be pretty cost-effective, and yet they're very bright, and they have the sort of bright blue light that is going to optimally stimulate those melanopsin ganglion cells. And indeed, I have one of these. I don't use a ring light. I use a light pad. The particular light pad I bought on Amazon. So I place that on the desk in front of me, and I turn it on essentially throughout this phase 1 of the day that keep my levels of alertness up, because the early part of the day is when I do the majority of that focused work. For those of you that can place your desk near a window, and even better to open the window, that would be really fantastic. Why would I say open the window? Well, it turns out that sunlight is going to be the best stimulus for waking up your brain and body through this melanopsin to hypothalamus system. And by looking at sunlight through a window, it's 50 times less effective than if that window were to be open, mostly because those windows filter out a lot of the wavelengths of blue light that are essential for stimulating the eyes and this wake-up signal. During phase 1, again, within 0 to about 8 or 9 hours after waking, bright lights in your environment. Now, in the afternoon, starting at about 9 and continuing until about 16 hours after waking, you want to start dimming the lights in that environment. Having lights that are in front of you is fine, but overhead lights at that time are not going to be optimal for the sorts of neurochemical states that your brain wants to be in. The states that I'm referring to are a shift from the dopamine and norepinephrine that's highest early in the day to increases in things like serotonin and other neuromodulators that put your brain into a state that's better for creative endeavors or for more abstract thinking. So what I recommend doing, and what I personally do, is I will turn off overhead lights in the afternoon. It's not completely dim, it's not completely dark, but I will start to reduce the amount of overhead light and just simply keep the light pad on and whatever other lamps I happen to be using. You also want to start reducing the amount of blue light that you're being exposed to. So somewhere around 4 or 5 p.m., which for me is, about 12 hours after I've been awake or 14 hours after I've been awake, I will turn off that light pad and start to transition the lights in my environment to more yellows and reds. Because I'll try and dim the screen that I'm working on so that I can still manage to see everything that I need to see, but it's quite a bit dimmer than it was early in the day. And then I'll just mention, because I know there are people who are working in the middle of the night, there's phase 3, which is about 17 to 24 hours after waking. And I realize that for shift workers or for people that are pulling all-nighters or for students, oftentimes you need to be awake and studying in the middle of the night. If you're going to be doing work in that third phase of your circadian cycle, you really want to limit the amount of bright light that you're getting in your eyes to just the amount that allows you to do the work that you're doing. Because if you get light in your eyes that's any brighter than that, you're going to severely deplete your melatonin levels. You're going to severely shift your circadian clock, and it's effectively like traveling to another time zone. That's what your body registers it as, and it can really throw your sleep and your metabolism and a number of other things out of whack. Now, there's an exception to this, which is if you really want to be awake, it can often be beneficial to flipping on all the lights in the room and keeping them really bright. So you have to determine the trade-off between whether or not you want to shift your clock or whether or not you want to get the work done. And I would say the ideal situation is to sleep at night and to do your work during the day and in the afternoon. But if you do have to be awake in the middle of the night, do understand that you want to dim those lights overall. You would not want to use that LED. You would not want to have overhead lights on unless you're really struggling to stay awake. There are a few things that you can do without taking stimulants in order to stay up all night. One of them that's a little less commonly known is you can drink 32 ounces of water and commit to not going to the bathroom for 90 minutes at least. Turns out that there's a circuit that goes from your bladder, literally neurons that go from your bladder to your brainstem. And when you have to urinate, it makes you very alert, as many of you have probably experienced. This is actually what wakes us up in the middle of the night when we have to use the bathroom, is this circuit for alertness that goes from full bladder. It's signaled by the bladder being full to the brainstem. So you know how difficult it is to fall asleep when you have to use the restroom, for instance. So that's one tool. The other thing is, again, to flip on as many bright lights in the environment as possible. And then, of course, people will rely on stimulants like caffeine or even more aggressive stimulants. That's not something I necessarily recommend, but if you do, in fact, have to use all-nighters for any reason, you can maximize this bladder-to-brain approach and the bright light approach. Everyone has different retinal sensitivities. Everyone will find that different levels of brightness will cause them to be alert. You really want to just modulate across the 24-hour cycle where it's very bright as it safely can be early in the day so that you are alert. You can do your focused, detailed work in that first phase. And then in the afternoon, as you move into more creative type works or abstract thinking or working with other people in kind of a brainstorming mode, that you would shift to dimmer lights, yellow lights, eliminate the blue lights as much as possible.